So please, welcome to the stage, Go Crazy, and welcome Laura.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Is the mic working? Okay, excellent. That's a good start. I'm distracted because I'm looking at my first slide and I've noticed that I've failed to make the first T in the product pathway a link, and I'm really annoyed, so apologies for that. You can probably still figure it out, but that's what's going on there. I am a product consultant and coach. I've been doing both of those for a while. Despite appearances, I am not class of 2021 graduate of the University of Exeter. What I am is not very good at packing enough clothes for an English summer. I'm actually class of 1997 Essex, if you're interested, art history, which just goes to show that anyone can be a product manager. I'm here to talk about three of my favourite fun mistakes that I've made in product discovery over the years, and more broadly, how you can use some of my really bad decisions to help you to make better ones, I hope. And there is time for questions at the end if anybody wants to ask anything about, let me see if I can work the clicker, what not to do. So in a minute, I'll explain how extremely well qualified I am to talk all about what not to do. But I want to start out with a massive caveat, which is that actually anything you do is probably fine. The only bad idea is to do nothing at all. And there's a story in this book, which some of you may have seen. It's not about product development, but it is about making cool things that people want. And the story is very pertinent. I can't source it beyond the book. It may be entirely made up. It's a good story anyway, it doesn't matter. I'm just going to read it to you. The ceramics teacher announced on opening day that he was dividing the class into two groups. All those on the left side of the studio, he said, would be graded solely on the quantity of work they produced. All those on the right solely on its quality. His procedure was simple. On the final day of class, he would bring in his bathroom scales and weigh the work of the quantity group. 50 pounds of pots would rate an A, 40 pounds a B, and so on. Those being graded on quality, however, needed to produce only one pot, albeit a perfect one, to get an A. Came grading time and a curious fact emerged. I know you know where this is going. The works of highest quality were all produced by the group being graded for quantity. It seems that while the quantity group was busily churning out piles of work and learning from their mistakes, the quality group had sat theorising about perfection, I don't know if that sounds familiar to anyone, and in the end had little more to show for their efforts than grandiose theories and a pile of dead clay. Which is just as quickly and more succinctly summed up by this cartoon. In other words, the more times you do it, the better you get at it, whatever it might be. So although I am going to talk about what not to do, actually the only really, really bad mistake you can make is to do nothing at all. Do something, there will be benefit in it. But let's leave that aside just for a minute and get on with the talk. And why don't I tell you why I've made so many mistakes? It's because, as you've heard, I've been working in digital for a long, long time. And I've worked at a lot of companies, some of which you can see up there, and lots of which you can't because I'm being selective. For example, I haven't included Bulb, where I did a 6-month contract, but I promise it wasn't my fault they went under and cost you all £2 billion. That wasn't me. But yes, so I've worked at some of these places. Shout out to some colleagues here from The Guardian and the BBC. Don't worry, you're not named individually in any of these stories. I started out at The Guardian and I worked in sort of media and broadcast for quite a few years. Then when I decided to start freelancing, I kind of diversified into a few more areas. And I really enjoy actually about freelancing that you can kind of just dive into a new industry. Bulb isn't the greatest working experience I've ever had, but it was super interesting to learn about the energy industry for a while. So, I'm just going to adjust the size of my notes because I can't quite see them. Excuse me while I try to recover my cursor. Okay. So, In those 20-something years that I've been working in tech, I have made a lot of mistakes. And the reason that people still hire me is that every time a new question or a new problem crops up, I've probably dealt with it or something a bit like it before. And I've probably dealt with it really badly. And I've probably learned from that. And now I've probably got a better idea about how to deal with it. So what we're going to talk about now, in a second, is 3 of the mistakes I think are most interesting from my experience of the last 20 years or so in that world. But before I do that, I imagine that probably most of the people in this room are on the same page, but I just want to kind of make sure that we're all clear on what I mean in this context when I talk about product discovery. So I'm talking about the whole period and the process during which you're figuring out what problem you want to solve and who you want to solve it for, and what a solution might look like, and the whole period that you're doing research into what that might be, and you might be doing very detailed and kind of formal research. You might be doing what I did at Comic Relief, where there was no budget for any sort of research or user or usability testing, and so I would go into the swag cupboard in the office and I would get a load of like Red Nose Day key rings and limited edition Kate Moss Rimmel red lipsticks. And I would take them out into cafes and pubs nearby to the office and I'd say, hi, would you like some free stuff in return for sitting down with me for 15 minutes so I can show you a thing and you can tell me what you think? So everything from sort of very expensive formalized testing, which I have also done, through to the kind of research that you can do just by reading, because lots of other people have researched things and there will always be findings of other people's that you can use. Looking at what else is out there, all of the different ways, you know this, that you can use to determine what the problem might be and how you might be able to start solving it. One thing I think is really important is that work, that discovery process is done by the whole team. I have worked in contexts where either just product or just product and design or product and research kind of go off and do discovery. And I don't think that's the most effective way to work. It really works much, much better if the whole team, and that's not just your engineering and your QA, but it's everyone. It's your stakeholders, it's your customer service people, it's your marketing people. Everybody who kind of cares about what's going to happen should ideally be somehow involved in discovery. So that whole process, whatever it looks like, however many people it involves, that gets you to the point, and not once, but repeatedly over and over again, of saying, all right, we're ready to make a bet on this thing. We want to move this experiment forward and see whether we still think that it's a good idea. So that's what I mean when I talk about discovery. That was a bit long-winded. And one other thing that I wanted to just say about that testing and experimentation is I think it's really important to remember that we're not trying to prove our hypotheses when we go through that process. We're trying to de-risk them. So we're not sitting around waiting until, we're not theorizing about perfection, like the people in the quality group in the ceramics class. We're amassing data until we feel like we've got enough to make a reasonably good guess, and we're reducing the risk of getting something catastrophically wrong. And we can reduce that risk by making sure that we're asking some of the right questions. I have got 3 sort of takeaways that, if you squint, relate tangentially to the 3 stories I'm going to tell you. I'll come back to these afterwards, but just so that they're in your heads. Defining success up front. One piece of evidence, however compelling it is, sometimes even if it's extremely compelling, that's an even worse reason to use it as your only piece of proof for moving forward. And then going back to if you were in Jeff's keynote yesterday, the point about being outcome-led in your product development process rather than output-led, so looking for a problem worth solving rather than a solution worth trying. So those, as I say, I'll come back to these, but those are the sort of, if you go away, like if you take a photo of a slide, take a photo of that slide, is what I think I'm saying. So mistake number 1, failing to agree as a group on what success looks like. We all know that we want to test the stuff we build before we necessarily send it out there and spend lots of time and effort and money and resource pushing it out to everyone in a final public live version. And we say we don't know if people will like this thing or if they'll use it. or how they'll use it, so let's test it. And what we always remember to do is decide how we want to test it. Like, are we going to run a survey or a questionnaire? Are we going to build a false door test to gauge appetite for it without building the thing itself? Are we going to build a beta or some kind of mock-up and have people look at that? We decide who we're going to test it with, who's going to be the audience for our test. And what we quite often leave out is what is the result that will tell us that we're willing to move forward with this? Like, what is the concrete metric that says to us, yes, this is worth pursuing, or no, this is not worth pursuing? And my favorite example of getting this super wrong is from when I was head of product at Comic Relief, which was my last sort of proper job. And if you've ever interviewed me for a job, you will have definitely heard this story, so I apologise if I'm repeating myself to you. But in the lead up to Red Nose Day, we had this module on the homepage of rednoseday.com. Donate now, online, super quick, super easy, 10, 50, actually at the time it was 10, 50 or £20. I looked at that and I thought, those are very high sums, given that people could be here for any kind of a reason. How many of them really are going to donate 50 or £100 just because we're asking them to? What would happen if we reduced the sums? My hypothesis is that we would get more donations. So we ran an A/B test. A small segment of the audience was shown a version of this that said 5, 10, £20. Immediately, the number of donations flew up. I mean, you could see it happening in real time on the chart. Awesome. Okay, let's roll it out to everybody. Yeah, I know that you know where this is going. It was only me that didn't. Obviously, over time, there weren't many people donating £50 or £100, but there were enough to outweigh the much bigger number of people who were donating 5 and 10. I'd made a couple of significant mistakes here. One of them was just deciding that I was, my thinking was enough to make a plan and roll it out and do it, not having a conversation with the whole team. The second one, though, the really obvious one, the really stupid one, was not figuring out what it was we were actually trying to achieve. In my head, it was, oh, we want more donations. Let's try this. Oh, great, it's giving us more donations. Obviously, that wasn't the objective. The objective clearly was to raise more money for charity so that we could fund more charitable projects. And if I had sat down with other people, like probably even just with one other person before running this experiment and figured it out, we would have got to that. We would have got to that much, much sooner. And it's not even, there's nothing sort of technical or complicated about that conversation. You can do like a 5 whys. If, that would have gotten us from more donations to more money fairly quickly. Just didn't do it. So, I will say, just as an aside and to completely undermine everything else I've just said, that we didn't yes, we got less money overall when we changed the numbers to lower numbers. That's not proof, right? It might have been that the people who saw the lower numbers might eventually have donated more over time because they might have donated multiple times. It might have depended on the time of year and whether it was about to be Red Nose Day or whether it wasn't. It might have made a different, the more modest ask might have made people more likely to donate in other contexts, like when they were watching Comic Relief on TV or when somebody asked them to sponsor them to sit in a bath of beans or whatever it is. So again, we're not talking about perfection. We're not talking ever about definitive proof. What we're talking about is the best possible signal that you can get with what you've got. And what I did here was I chose the wrong metric, the wrong signal, made the wrong decision. Luckily, everyone around me was much smarter than I was, spotted it straight away, and we reversed the change. So I don't think that overall it all went horribly wrong, but it could have done, and if it had been, that was my fault. This screen is actually captured much more recently from the Comic Relief website. So clearly the original approach, the one that we went back to, is still the one that they're using, and presumably is still the one that's working. The thing that made this exceptionally stupid was that it was really easy to run an A/B test because we had a thing and then we could go out to a small segment of the audience with a different thing. And yes, we had the wrong metric, But actually, assuming that we'd had the right metric, okay, which one is getting us the most money, then it would have been really easy to decide which was the better variant, right? Because one of them would have got us the most money. It's not always that simple. Obviously, if you can A/B test with a really, really clear success measure and see immediately which of your options is best, then that's easy, that's fine. And that's, you know, you've done your job, and as a team, you haven't really had to have a very long or complicated conversation about what does success look like. It's much more complicated when you, say if you're building something from scratch. You know, would 10% of people who land on this page donating be good? What about 50%? Should it be 80%? Do you know what? It doesn't matter at all. It doesn't matter. The only thing that matters is that you and your team all agree on what your metric is. Because what you can do then is you can say, all right, we didn't hit 50%, but we did hit 40. And actually that's all right for now. Let's keep going. Or let's try something else. And let's benchmark that and say, all right, is it more or less than 40? Now we've got actual data that we can move forward with. So the first number that you pick can be completely arbitrary. You just all need to be happy with it. And then you can sort of move on. All you need is enough that says, okay, this is still in the running or this isn't, right? And you can choose what number or what metric you base that off. What helps even more with that is if you triangulate your data, which is just a fancy way of saying run multiple tests, which brings me to number 2 fun mistake. This is my favorite, but it wasn't actually me that made it. I've stolen this story from, I knew people who were involved. Such a good story, I feel like they probably won't mind if I steal it. If anyone in the room was involved, feel free to let me know if I've got something wrong. So this is a story about the BBC. Back in about 2012, I think it was, they were thinking about how they displayed the weather online. And, you know, for decades, the way that the BBC could communicate the weather to their audience was in a minute or two of broadcast airtime. And so they had to be very precise and very clear and get the key information across in a limited amount of time. Well, they realized, well, now that we've got the web, we don't have that limitation. We can have as much information as we want, as much information as is available, we can share. And so they created a new version of BBC Weather with a lot more info in it. And they put a link up on the BBC Weather pages that said, hey, we've got a new BBC Weather thing. It's in beta. Do you want to try it out? And they got a bunch of people testing the beta and giving feedback. And the feedback was super positive. Everybody loved it. So they rolled it out. And these are comments from a blog post that the BBC published at the same time as the new weather format went live. And I haven't been selective here. I've just picked like the first few. It was overwhelmingly unpopular. Why was it overwhelmingly unpopular? Because the group that had opted in were weather nerds. Of course they were. Who is going to say, yes, please show me your new weather beta and let me give you feedback on it, apart from people who are really interested in the weather. So, of course, their feedback was positive. And then these people came along and thought, oh, that thing that I used to use to tell me in 10 seconds whether or not I need a coat this afternoon is now suddenly enormously, overwhelmingly complex, was doing the job I needed it to, and now no longer is. So what could the team have done differently? Well, they could have run that beta with a randomly selected audience rather than a self-selecting group of weather geeks. Even better, they could have done both. They could have done both of those things, triangulated the data that they got in and worked out what was working for who. Because they were right that they could give everything to everybody, but not everybody wanted everything. And it wouldn't have been that hard in that process to figure out what would have been the right thing to show to which audience. I'm guessing that most people in this room have read this book, Continuous Discovery Habits by Teresa Torres. But if you haven't, this is my sort of one resource recommendation to help you design small, cheap, iterative, repeating experiments that let you gather that data, that let you triangulate it, that just massively reduce that risk that you are making some kind of enormous assumption that that just is wrong, because you haven't triangulated against other sources of data that will kind of bring it back in and get you much closer to a lower risk version of what you're going to do. Okay, so mistake number 3 is the trickiest one, I think. And again, this, as I mentioned earlier, this comes back to the points that Jeff was making in his keynote yesterday about being outcome-based rather than output-based, because being output-based is where you think of a solution and then you make it. And being outcome-based is where you think of a problem and how it could be solved. And the example I've got of this one is one where I don't really have a sort of, and then everything was fine and we all lived happily ever after story to tell. But I'm going to tell you it anyway. So a couple of years ago, I was contracting for The Economist and I was looking after their mobile apps. The Economist's business model is subscriptions. The people who used the mobile app were paying quite a lot of money for it, were quite involved and dedicated. Well, those who used it at all used it a lot and cared about it a lot. And so the senior management at The Economist were very keen that we not do anything to annoy those people. Like, let's keep them on board at all costs. The old Economist app was run by a third party. Their software was used with multiple clients. So anytime we wanted to make a change, it was kind of tricksy because we can't do anything that's just for you. We have to roll it out to everybody. It was expensive. They were paying to have it hosted and maintained and managed, and it was super inflexible. So they brought an in-house team of mobile apps people in. They brought me in as PM. And they said, can you build a new one? But can it do all the same stuff as the old one does? And we had a conversation about that because the old one demonstrably and acknowledgedly, if that's a word, had some flaws. Like there were some bits of it that didn't work that well. But the ask that I was given was it just needs to be the same. It just needs to be the same because we cannot lose these users. And so when they switch from the old app to the new one, everything for them has to be the same. And I didn't push back on that enough. And what I should have done there, and what we as a team should have done there, is we should have pushed back harder and said, look, what is it? What is it about the old app that people like? Let's understand what needs of theirs are being met, what problems they have are being solved. And let's make sure that in the new one, we meet those needs, we solve those problems. It doesn't mean we have to slavishly reproduce every feature, even the crappy ones that no one can maintain and that people quite regularly complain about anyway. That was about appetite for risk. And that is something that I think we all come across all the time when we're working within organizations. So I don't think that in that case I could have said, like, no, sorry, halt, we're going back to basics and going right back into discovery with the app. It just wouldn't have flown with the people whose money we were spending. But we could have, for example, said, look, can we run a couple of small experiments, a few tests, just to try and really understand what problems we're solving here for users, rather than just saying it's got to be the same, because it didn't have to be the same. And that fear of losing people, or of people being furious with change, like people will be furious when you change one of your products. That's good. It means they care about your product. Fine, let them be furious. Fix things that need fixing, but keep moving forward, because there are very few products in the world that people are going to use from the day they discover them until the day they die, right? There's going to be some churn. Some people will move on, other people will turn up. The people who stick around, if you can keep them happy, then great. But, trying to speak to a need that you've basically invented by saying, this is the thing that we've got and therefore we need this thing and nothing else, is not a productive way forward. So this was one where I feel like I was sort of still working my way through it at this point. And as I say, you can nudge in that direction without necessarily saying, right, we've got to go right back to basics and do discovery from scratch, because that isn't going to fly in a lot of organizations. Here's a picture of Henry Ford in front of one of his any color as long as it's black cars. You've heard, I'm sure, the story about Henry Ford saying that if you asked people what they wanted, they would have said faster horses. And that's sometimes used to illustrate the idea that people don't know what they want. But actually, I'm not sure that's quite what that story illustrates. Because generally, most of us, like, we're not Steve Jobs. We're not inventing a brand new thing that no one had ever thought of until we suddenly magicked it into their lives. I think that what this story illustrates more effectively is the importance of asking the right questions. Because faster horses is the solution. It's not the problem. The problem is I want to go and do my business more quickly, or I want to go and be able to see my family and come back in a day. Or, you know, I don't know why people needed cars in the 1900s, but faster horses is the description of the solution. It's not the description of the problem. And I think we can get back again to the tried and trusted kind of 5 whys to drill right down into what is it that people actually need. And once you can describe the need, then you've just got a much, much, much better chance of being able to meet it than by starting with the solution. So back to these 3 points. If you don't know what success looks like, then you will accidentally raise less money for charity than you were supposed to. So don't do that. If you have one enormously compelling piece of evidence based on a flawed test, you need to do some more tests. If you invent a solution without understanding the problem, there's no guarantee that anybody will be interested in what you present them with. And I'm going to finish up with a slide that is quite annoying. But it's a final thought for you. So this is the US mathematician and statistician. I've practiced saying that word a lot the last few days. John Tukey, who is credited with, among other things, the invention of the word software. So we should all be very grateful to him. It doesn't really matter whether or not you understand this quote. I'm not convinced that I do. But in maths, asymptote is a line that curves towards a straight line without ever actually meeting it. And what he's saying here, I think, is that even if you're a mathematician and a statistician, it's okay to draw conclusions from something that's approaching a proof. It doesn't have to be perfect. And if you wait for perfection and sit around theorizing about it and not making pots, that's the one way to guarantee that you'll never find it. And that doesn't mean that you haven't got enough to get started. I don't know if anyone saw Neha's talk yesterday, last talk of the day in this track. She and I both coach with the Product Refinery, and they have a Dear Coach newsletter, and we sort of rotate answering questions. And recently I answered a question there that was, how do I get started with building a new product from scratch? So I wrote quite a long and involved answer, but actually the only thing that was really important in that answer was, like, it doesn't matter as long as you just do get started. Just do something. And it's fine to make mistakes. It's great to make mistakes. The more mistakes you make, the better. It's really, really good to make mistakes. And as long as you're sort of in a context where you can explain why those mistakes are good, then actually you're all going to move forward much, much faster. And it's really worth doing. Yeah, start anywhere. Doesn't matter where. Have a hypothesis. Agree on what it is you want to test it, and just keep going. Do more and more. And eventually, everything you do will contribute. The things that you discover that are terrible. I think Edison said, I haven't failed 10,000 times. I've succeeded 10,000 times in doing something wrong. And that's like, each of those failures is a success. Each of those mistakes helps. And the more of them you make, the better you'll get, and the further forward you'll get, even if the curve never actually touches the straight line. And that is kind of it.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Laura. That was brilliant. Any questions from the audience? Yes. Okay.
Thanks, that was really, really interesting. You look like you've had a really varied career. Where was the best place you've worked, and where got that really right?
What a good question. I don't know what it's like there now, but I did about 15 months of a 3-month contract at DAZN, the sports streaming place. And they had, I mean, they were helped by the fact that they weren't a legacy company. They were purely digital. And everything they did was sort of built by and with people who had really only ever worked in digital or primarily worked in digital. And it just meant that all of that sort of, they also had a huge amount of money, which helped, because all of that appetite for risk and the idea that actually, I mean, you and I know that even when there isn't much money, it's much better to take small risks up front than to risk everything on something 18 months down the line that will almost certainly turn out to be no good. But that's really hard to demonstrate, and it can be really hard to convince people of, especially in very risk-averse organisations like charities. Comic Relief was really difficult to have that conversation in, because people didn't want to spend money unless they knew exactly what they were getting in return. At DAZN, there was a really, really strong experiment, hypothesize, test, repeat, iterate culture. And it's often hard to sort of know before you join a company whether or not that's going to be true, but when you find it, it's quite magical, which is why my 3-month contract ended up lasting significantly over a year, because I was just having a great time.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions whilst I'm up here?
One just here.
Fantastic. Oh.
Do you have any tips for how to talk to stakeholders who arrive with a solution and are really resistant to walking back to defining the problem instead?
So, yes. I mean, the first thing to say is that sometimes you do just have to do what they say. I have a sort of prioritization framework that I use to help decide what to do when we've got more stuff to do than we have capacity to do it, which is always. And there's columns for different things, like, will this increase revenue? Will it do, is there a legal reason we have to do this, is it? And one of them is called strategic, and what it actually means is the most important person says we have to. Because, yeah, sometimes you kind of do have to. But again, I think the way to do it is to, and actually Jeff also, I don't know if you saw his keynote yesterday, mentioned this. What you can do is you can sort of peel off a small subset of really smart people, and you can do a bit of work around hypotheses, around experimentation, and you can do it in support of that I'm very important and you must do this thing work. But if you can go along to that stakeholder and say, yeah, this is, we're working on it. We've done this experiment and we've got this data which will help us to build it better. You sort of sneak it in gradually over time. Especially as a contractor, people are not interested in me coming in and changing the way the team works, generally. But what you can do is do small, sneaky bits of work with the people that you most trust will be able to kind of get really meaningful results from doing some of that testing. And gradually your stakeholders start to think, oh, this is a team that actually brings more to my idea, to my solution, than it started off with. And maybe I can relinquish a little bit of that stranglehold, and maybe I can let them have a little bit more autonomy in terms of how we direct ourselves. It's difficult.
Good question. Anyone else? Yes.
Your Economist example. So, as an Economist reader who hasn't upgraded and resisting the new app, in my professional life, I regularly come across what I think of as the version 2 problem. We have a tool that everyone likes, but it was written in VB6, and so we decided it needs to be rewritten. Can you build one just the same? I have my own generic solution. I'm wondering if you have a generic solution. What's your advice when people say, we want one that does exactly the same as the current one, but not in VB6?
I don't think I have a generic solution because I think it depends a lot on things like budget and time constraints and what sort of audience and what size of audience you're talking to. But I would, and I did in that case, just not successfully, say, can we go back to basics here and look at what the actual need is that's being met? Because maybe there are ways of meeting that need that are different from what we have today, and maybe some of those also benefit us in other areas. And so budget holders, for example, might be quite pleased if you were able to suggest a way of solving a particular or meeting a particular need or solving a problem that was going to be much cheaper than what you were doing in the old version. So I think there's, you can talk about the user need and how you meet it, but you can also, if you're lucky, figure out ways that also helps the business. And that, I think, is generally, for an organisation like The Economist anyway, is a more compelling thing than just talking about the user need. Because, if the thing is to be rebuilt because it's old, there probably are better ways of doing it. And if you can go into that, which is, again, why you need your engineers and, everybody on the team involved in that conversation. As a PM, you don't have enough information to know that, but the people around you will.
Great. Any other questions? No? Okay. Oh, fantastic. Well, we can break off for an early break. And another round of applause for Laura.